Welcome to Ask a Deer Processor. Today we ask, hey Chuck, how do you trim down cuts of meat?
Now we're going to work up these tenderloins. Any fat or any contamination that might have been on the surface of this tenderloin, we want to remove that. If during the field dressing process you left all the fat and such on there, when you peel that off, this is going to be perfectly clean. But anything that was contaminated during field dressing, we need to remove that. And we want to just take as little bit of that tissue off as we can. So that one's good. There's a little bit of fat on this one. You can see some, blood clots and things here. We'll take that off. And this stuff that I'm trimming off here is all going into scrap bucket, which is not going to be used for food. But the better job that you can do during your field dressing, the cleaner you keep these tenderloins, it's going to allow you to not have to trim off and thus lose any of the tenderloins that you would be using for food. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and work up a back leg. Any of this area here that was exposed during field dressing, you can see there's bits of leaves and grass and digesta that's on here. We're going to first trim that material off so that we don't have any of that into our meat that we're going to be serving our family. Just take off as thin a layer as you can while still getting the contamination off of there. Start out by, I've got the contamination off, and we're going to start by taking off any fat and muscle that's not going to be a part of our cuts. The anatomy of this back leg is we've got a femur leg bone, main leg bone, running right down at an angle to the kneecap. And you can see the kneecap by this real shiny hard area. So that's where we're going to be cutting from along the femur down to the kneecap. Then we're going to loosen the meat along the lower leg on both sides and cut off the tendon, and then we'll be removing that bone from the leg. So I'm going to take and make a cut right down. I'm feeling the bone that's in there with my knife, come down to the kneecap and cut down to the table. So that's exposed this sirloin tip muscle, and you can see the femur laying right there. Then I'm going to take my knife and run right down the top of the femur, around the joint, run right down the back leg, and I'm going to cut this area here where we cut the tendon open so we could have a place to hang that. That area is not clean, so I'm going to keep my knife away from that area. Then I'm going to finish down here on the lower leg by just running my knife along the lower leg bone to remove that portion of the shank. This lower portion here is called the shank. You can use the shank as a cut of meat if you choose. It just uses moist heat cookery. You could cut that at that joint right there and save that if you choose. But most of the time, most people, this would go into stew meat or into further processed items like burger or sausage. I'm going to continue by cutting underneath that femur. Remove this shank muscle, turn this around, and then I'm going to cut. I've already got on either side of the leg bone, and I'm just letting my knife run right along the bone getting that partially loosened. I leave it still attached up here so that I can have this portion kind of holding this bone for me to finish removing any meat that I want to save before throwing this bone into the scrap bin. On the deer leg, just like on a chicken leg, in addition to the big bone, there is a small little kind of pin type of bone that you want to make sure that this thing does not go into your burger or sausage. So be careful laying on the, right there, starting close to the joint and running down the leg part way is that little pin bone there. We want to make sure that we don't throw that into our burger. And you can spend as much time as you want to trying to get these bones as clean as you want. Once I've got most of the meat off of the leg, I'll go ahead and cut around the head of this femur, getting this leg down. Now, if you want to use the leg bones to make soup, stock, or give to your dog, it's easy enough to hit between this joint from the lower leg and the upper leg, and then this bone is ready to go. We're now going to separate this leg into the major muscle groups, which is the top round, the bottom round, and the sirloin tip. And we're going to do that by cutting through the connective tissue that is separating those muscle groups. Good sharp knife, pulling those muscles apart. It just kind of lays open there and you're able to easily cut. All I'm doing is pretty much is cutting just connective tissue. I'm not cutting muscle tissue to separate this top round from the rest of it. The shank is likewise, it's just kind of laying in there on the bottom round, and I'm using my hook to kind of pull that muscle away and kind of teasing that loose with my knife. Now I'm going to do the same thing with removing the sirloin tip as I did with the inside leg, just by cutting through connective tissue that's holding that muscle to the rest of the leg. The sirloin tip kind of looks like a little football. What we have left here is the bottom round, and this upper portion here is the sirloin. On a larger deer, you could make some sirloin steaks out of this if you choose, or this could be a nice roast, or it may just go into your trimmings for sausage and burger. Just cut across the top of this muscle group is what we call the bottom round. That separates the sirloin from the bottom round. So the three main muscles that we were talking about getting from the back leg is the inside or top round, the bottom round, and then the sirloin tip. To process the inside or top round for steaks or roasts, I'm going to go ahead and remove this cap muscle, which is laying like would have been on between the legs of that deer. It's just a real thin muscle that lays on the top there. And as you're removing that, the seam kind of follows going right down over the top and down. And you're starting to pick up some other small muscle groups we're going to trim all that off. And that makes this inside round, you know, very clean, very lean. And this piece is now ready as a roast. It can be cut in half if you need a smaller portion size, or you can go ahead and cut some leg steaks out of this. You know, the bottom, or sorry, the top round, the inside leg here, this is a very desirable cut of meat. You can dry heat cook this using dry roasting or frying it or grilling it. It'll still be acceptable because it's the more tender between these other two cuts of meat that we got from the hind leg. In order to cut steaks, we can see the way the muscle fibers run, and we want to make our cut across that grain to make that more palatable when we make our steaks. So we're just going to kind of face that there, and then we're going to cut our leg steaks. You cut them however thick that you want for the type of cooking that you're going to do. If you're going to do, you know, a fast cook method, you know, then you probably, like frying, you'd probably want these pieces of meat to be a little thinner. If you're going to be, you know, grilling them and you kind of want it to rare, medium, rare degree of doneness, you may want to cut them a little bit thicker. And by all means, if you're going to use a moist heat cooking, like making a Swiss steak, then you would make these thicker also. So we've got these steaks out of the top round. Okay. The bottom round has a pad of fat associated right where the top of the shank muscles were. We're going to remove that. Even if there's not very much fat there, we are going to remove that piece because inside there is a lymph node that just is not very appetizing looking in a cut of meat if you're going to be serving that to your family. It's perfectly safe to eat, but the lymph system is kind of the filtration system in the body. So if there's any bacteria or infection, that they're going to be associated with that lymph node. So that was just inside this fat, which was laying right here above where the shank was on this bottom round. And we're just going to go ahead and trim up this bottom round, any bits of meat, fat on that. And I'm going to take this real heavy connective tissue off. That was laying between the sirloin tip and the bottom round. And we're going to remove that just by taking our knife, inserting it, and cutting, just trimming that off. This connective tissue has a lot of collagen connective tissue in it. You know, it's a little bit of that material in your sausage is fine. If you've got a grinder that will handle that connective tissue, your sausage will be improved by having a little bit of this collagen in there. But we're going to go ahead and save that, put it in our trimmings. Now we have this bottom round. Sometimes some deer will have a lot of fat here. Some deer will not have a lot of fat. If you want to remove that fat, you can. However, for this particular roast, I'm going to leave a little bit of this fat on there. All I'm going to do is kind of square this up so that it's fairly uniform in thickness so that it cooks evenly. And that would be our bottom round. We generally use this as a roast. You can cut steaks from it if you'd like to by just cutting across perpendicular to this muscle right here, if we were talking about beef, this is the muscle that you call the eye round. Where we would cut steaks just by cutting along like that. The sirloin tip lends itself very good to being in a roast. You can cut steaks out of it, but when you've pulled it off away from the leg, you've taken all the connective tissue. It kind of came off, stayed on the leg, and the larger leg piece. So this is very clean and does not need any further trimming. I will show you what the steaks look like on this so that you can see why they may not be quite as desirable. The sirloin tip is made up of three main muscle groups. It's got some connective tissue that runs in here, but when you're cooking this, these muscles have a tendency to want to separate. So if you like leg steaks better than you do roast, by all means you can cut steaks out of it, but they're just not as good as what you would get from the top round, or inside round as it's also called. Generally use moist heat cooking for the bottom round as well as the sirloin tip. When we're making material up that's going to go into sausage or burger, we're going to try to trim off most of the deer fat. In the Midwest, the deer are eating a lot of the same things that our animals that we raise for production agriculture eat, corn and soybeans. And so they've got a fairly high plane in nutrition. Any feed that the animal is eating, there are vitamins and minerals and things that are being deposited into that deer's muscle tissue. There are some materials that are fat soluble, such as beta carotene, and you'll see that show up as a yellowish color, and that's generally seen in the fat. Some things like that you might find out west, like that the deer eating of sagebrush, that sage is a fat soluble material that will oftentimes be present in the fat of the animal, and so it will lend a different flavor to the meat than what you may wish to have. So you want to trim most of the fat away from the muscle tissue. Anything that's going into sausage, the spices that you put in the sausage may mask some of that flavor, but that's one of the reasons why we oftentimes will trim most of the fat off of our deer meat before we would eat that, is because it may have some flavors that we're not expecting or not used to. But next thing I want to work up is the loins. The loin lays on either side of the backbone, and it's very uniform in shape, and it runs from the hip bone cartilage in the back leg there at the pelvic bone all the way down to where it kind of tapers down in just behind the shoulder. We're going to go ahead and remove this outer layer of fat and subcutaneous muscle away from the loin by cutting part of the way through, and then we're able to physically pull this fat away from the loin. We didn't have to trim that with our knife at all. There's some, we've taken all this fat off of here and all these little muscles that are associated with right at the end of where the ribs were. And also there's this piece of yellow connective tissue. This is a ligament that helps the animal support its head when it's standing. We want to make sure that ligamentum comes out, because that will not break down during cooking and will be very chewy and not desirable to have in our cut of meat. Just take some of this material. That's going to go into our tub for sausage and stuff. There is a layer of muscle. If we've done a good job of skinning, this muscle would have stayed on the carcass. If you had to skin the animal by cutting it with a knife, a lot of times this muscle is going to stay with the hide, but it's here, it's edible, so we're going to go ahead and save that and put it in our burger and sausage material bucket. Go ahead and remove that calf muscles from the other loin. And you can see that that animal was shot in the shoulder, but some of the blood has kind of worked its way up in between the seams of the shoulder and the loin. We're going to have to trim out these, this blood clots. Okay. We have to trim out this, the blood clots. And most of the time, that material kind of migrates up between the muscle groups. So oftentimes if you just kind of get that started and kind of lifting it up, pulling it away, it'll come off, leaving things fairly clean underneath it. Some of it you may have to trim off. Again, we want to take off as thin a layer as we can. Try to salvage as much of that meat as we can. But any of this blood clots and stuff, we'll trim those off so that none of that goes into our sausage material. You can soak this, like if there's a fair amount of this don't want to throw away all that meat, you can soak this in water or soak it in salt water, and that'll pull a lot of that blood and blood clots away, and you can salvage a little bit more meat if you want to do that. On the loin, there is a fairly heavy band of connective tissue laying on the loin back here closer to where the back leg was. And we want to take that off. Sure, we could cut, chops or steaks, but it's going to still have that connective tissue, and it's kind of, a little bit chewy. So to make this product as desirable as possible, we're going to take that layer of connective tissue off. And if anybody has ever dressed fish, what I'm going to do now is run my knife just along that connective tissue, like some people will fillet fish, running it just underneath the skin. And I'm going to remove that connective tissue. And, very little of that meat was, lost, maybe trimming that. And this material can go into your grinding material. So now we've got that connective tissue off of the loin. We'll go ahead and cut some chops out of it. We can leave this as a roast if you desire. It's very good just dry heat cooking, or grilling it if we cut chops. But you can cut this in half, cut it in thirds, whatever size portions that you want to package for yourself. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and cut some chops. Because of the size of a deer loin, a single chop on especially a smaller deer may not be a full portion size. So just to make more desirable portion size, what we're going to do is cut a butterfly chop by cutting part way through the loin and then cut through all the way through the loin. And that'll allow us to open that piece of meat up that gives a little nicer size portion for those that are eating that meal. So cut part way through, cut all the way through, part way through, all the way through, part way through, all the way through, and just keep going until you get down to the very end. And then you've got all these nice butterfly chops. This, as we got towards the front of the animal, there was this other muscle that you can see kind of laying on the top here, and it's right here on these chops. If you've ever had a ribeye steak and there's a section of muscle that's like really, really tender, that muscle is called the spinalis, and that's a very desirable, very tender portion of that loin, and that's on these pieces of loin chops that are not the most attractive, but these are going to be the better eating compared to some of these others. So, give these to your guests or save these for yourself, whichever you want to have the best eating experience. I'm going to go ahead and remove that connective tissue on this other loin. So there we've got about 16 butterfly chops for that average sized deer that we've done. When we get into the shoulders, the animal was shot through the shoulder, so we want to try to trim off any of the material that was, contaminated. This area right here where the shot went through, we want to make sure we trim that out. Actually, we prefer, when we're removing that shoulder, if we could have trimmed out that where the shot was, we would have done that before that even got laid on the table. We could have trimmed that area off. Now, this deer front shoulder, we've got the shoulder blade kind of laying like at that angle. We've got the humerus leg bone running through at this angle, and then the lower shank coming right down there. So when we're cutting this, we're going to have one bone that's going that way, one bone that way, and one bone that way. And we just got to allow our knife to remove that muscle tissue away from those bones, so you kind of know what that anatomy is. And the shoulder blade laying here on this surface is flat, so it's going to be very easy for us to take that muscle off of that portion. So when we're cutting the shoulder, it's not a bad idea to kind of remove the pieces of meat kind of in the natural seams of the of the muscle. Because if there's any blood clots and stuff, they would probably be in between the muscle groups rather than actually in the muscle. Now we're just going to, remove the meat from the shank. There again, if you wanted to save these shanks as a bone-in cut, you could. Then I'm going to take the meat off the top of the shoulder, the humerus, this main long bone in the shoulder, and then I'm going to run my knife along the shoulder blade here. Basically what I've done is just taken the meat off of the top of each of these bones so that we can easily see where the bone is to remove the meat from it. Now we'll go ahead and take off this meat off of the humerus. Take off this chunk of fat. Loosen this muscle on the front side of the shoulder blade. In fact, you can take that off. If you've done a good job of taking it off, there's a ridge that runs down the back of the shoulder blade. This would have been the outside of the animal. This ridge of bone is going that direction. And what I did was just kind of took my knife and I just kind of scooped that out so that could, I've got all the meat trimmed away from that part of the shoulder. Run my knife down the other side of the shoulder, and I'm going to start just by kind of loosening the meat, pulling away from the bone, the meat staying on the table. And I've removed the bone from the muscle. I'll go ahead and trim off any other meat that's still on the shoulder blade and on the shank and on the humerus. There again, if you were wanting to make some bone broth or something, you can by all means cut up the bones and use those, but otherwise they go into scrap. If the deer has been shot through the shoulder, you'd have to trim off any contamination, but by and large, this is all, intact, and there's, no blood clots in it, so this is ready to be cut up into, for a roast, or can go into your tub for your ground materials. If you're going to use anything for a roast, you're basically going to be using this bigger, thicker portion that would be the roast that you'd use. This would be a piece of meat that if it was in a beef, this would be a chuck roast.
Is that your favorite roast, Chuck?
Yes, it is actually. This chuck roast is something you would moist heat cook in a crock pot with some potatoes and carrots or something. It's very desirable. On this shoulder, we've got a lot more stuff that we need to trim off, and this is blood clots associated with as a result of the shot. You can see evidence of where the deer was shot right in here. Ideally, this would not go on your cutting table. Ideally, this would have been trimmed off before the piece of meat even went on the table. We're going to get that trimmed off and set out of the way for right now. And we're going to, if we disassemble this shoulder by kind of peeling back the layers, it'll be easiest easier for us to remove any of the blood clots. So I've got, pretty much all the muscle off in this layer. Now I'm going to try to go ahead and start teasing this. You can see that this is pretty much just kind of pulling away with very little effort on my part, cutting, removing all this, the blood clot stuff from the carcass, or from my shoulder here. The reason that we take out the blood clots, one is it's not very visually appealing. Yes, blood is protein. There's blood proteins that has nutritional value, but mainly you're just not used to eating blood like this. And in the case of for shelf life and storage, this blood here is a result of the wound that we had, and there's bacteria that may have introduced into the carcass from that wound site, or from the wound site, or if you went through the intestines, that came from the intestines and got into this area where might have been an edible portion. We want to remove all that, because in storage, in the before you freeze it, as you're thawing it out, those bacteria can grow, and you can have reduced shelf life, or in some cases you might have some foodborne illness as a result of that contamination. So that's why we're trying to trim away any of the blood clots and such. So I've pretty much got this all cleaned up, so now we're ready to start disassembling this shoulder, cutting the muscle loose from the shank. And all I'm doing is just letting my knife run right along the bone. Some people, you can buy, the knives like we use. These are ones that are used, by butchers. That's what their intended purpose is. You can use other types of knives. If you've got a 6-inch fillet knife or something that's sharp, you can use that to help, cut up your meat. Particularly like removing that tissue from the loin that I was working on earlier. If you got a fillet knife, that would be an ideal knife for that. But all I'm doing, nothing magical here. I'm just running my knife right along the bone. When I feel resistance as my knife hits bone, I just twist or turn a little bit so that I keep right on cutting. Got a little bit of blood clots here. Remove that. With archery, the broadhead that you use, most of the time they pass through intact. If we were doing a gun that was harvested with a firearm, particularly a rifle, those bullets may have a tendency to fragment. So wherever you see an entry wound or tissue where the bullet has passed through, you want to be very careful about trimming that and seeing if there's any pieces of lead or copper from your bullet, because you don't want to have that in your meat. It's a food safety risk. Somebody goes to eat that and they bite down hard, it could break a tooth, or if it's lead and go into their body system, you don't want that. So you want to be kind of cautious about trimming around the wound sites, especially on the firearm deer. And I'm going to trim out that wound site. Like I said, been better if this had been trimmed off and never hit the table. Keep that on the carcass or go directly to your scrap bucket. That's not going to be used for food. And then we're going to go ahead and try to clean up this piece of meat here by removing the blood clots. A little bit of the blood is not going to be a problem so much, but we want to try to get as much of that off of there just because it's not generally seen as palatable to most people. Removing this thin little bit of muscle. Sometimes there's a fair amount of fat over the top of the shoulder, and you can easily remove that by just letting your knife run right along the edge of the muscle and kind of work it, peel it, cut it loose. And then we just got these other pieces to go through, see if there's anything that needs to be trimmed off before it goes into grinding material. Any fat pads that are in there, it's generally fairly easy to remove those just by kind of pulling and cutting a little bit with your knife and get rid of those fat pads or any of the yellow connective tissue there along the back of the neck. Trim that out. Some people may think that they want to save the neck for a roast. If you're able to cut the meat from away from the neck and use that as a roast, that's fine, but I would not suggest that you do a bone-in neck roast because there are conditions called chronic wasting disease that, the knife, chronic wasting disease that is associated with the nervous tissue, the brain, the spinal column. And though the risk to humans is not something that, there's not hard evidence that it can be passed on to humans. It's one of those things that why take the risk? So we're doing this deer boneless, and if you're going to do a neck roast, then do that boneless as well rather than bone in, because in several states in the U.S. there is incidence of chronic wasting disease in the deer herd, and in the state of Illinois where we're at, it's started out with deer up along the Wisconsin border, up northern Illinois, and now it's kind of creeping down into the north central part of the state also. So just passed on from deer to deer. And that's pretty much completes the cutting up the deer into different cuts, and now all we have left to do is package it.
Thanks again to Riverbend Wild Game and Sausage Company. You can learn more about Illinois Learn to Hunt at learntohuntil.com.